Good evening. Tēnā koutou katoa, and no matter when you happen to be listening to this, it is always evening here at Tom's Terror Trove, and welcome to tonight's story, The Mysterious Mr Montague, by Jane Percival. If you enjoy my rendition, please do like and subscribe and hang about after the tale is told for a brief discussion of the story and an update on where the podcast is headed as 2025 draws its dying breath. I will just note now that portions of the fore and afterwards of this episode were recorded on my phone. The story itself was recorded in studio, however, so all is well on that score. And we'll be back in the studio for all subsequent episodes of Tom's Terror Trove. Now, settle in for The Mysterious Mr Montague, by Jane Percival. I never eat pork. It's not that I'm vegetarian, or Jewish, or Muslim. It's all to do with something that happened in the 70s, when I was 15 years old. As a kid, I had a fascination with meat. I have an early memory of accompanying Mum to our local butcher's and being given a fat, pink saveloy. She lifted me up onto the counter and I sat there munching on the sausage, looking around wide-eyed. I liked the smell of meat and sawdust. There was a plastic ribbon curtain dividing the shop front from the rest of the premises, and I caught glimpses of strange shapes when the strips moved in the breeze. My uncles, Eddie and John, owned a butcher shop in Kilburnie. On a visit when I was about 10, they took me through to the back to show me the other two rooms, a workroom where they processed the meat, and a walk-in cool room. I wandered around, careful not to slip, absorbing every detail. In the middle of the workroom there was a rectangular wooden block, scrubbed clean and scored with the marks of countless knives. There were also a couple of circular wooden chopping blocks. One had a small hatchet embedded in it. A range of gleaming knives and hacksaws hung from the left-hand wall. There were lidded bins containing mysterious pieces of raw flesh. Strings of pale sausages, looped like intestines, were hanging from the ceiling alongside fat black puddings. On the benches there were shag-pile carpets of tripe waiting to be trimmed and a huddle of glossy sheep kidneys. Through another door was the cooler, and I could see a row of carcasses hanging from huge hooks attached to the ceiling. There was that fleshy, bloody smell that I now identify with the butchering of meat. I didn't find it repelling. The floor was covered with sawdust, which added a subtle pine smell to the room. Later, when I was a teenager, I hung around long enough to be offered a job helping keep the workroom and cooler tidy and sweeping up the sawdust. After a while, it became accepted that when I'd finished school, I'd be taken on as my uncle's apprentice. One afternoon, I was left alone to mind the shop while my uncles made their deliveries. I was 15 and in my last year at college. In fact, I'd be trying to drop out for some time, but Mum had insisted I stay on until the end of the fifth form. It was just after 4 p.m. and quiet. Most of the housewives had finished their shopping for the day, and it was too soon for the after-work rush of people looking for a last-minute chop or piece of steak for that night's tea. I was in the workroom, trimming some hard fat off a piece of brisket when I heard the ring of the front doorbell. I returned to the shop, wiping my hands on my blue and white striped apron. The sprung door slammed shut behind me, but the guy didn't raise his eyes. He was looking intently at the various items displayed in front of the window. He wasn't someone I'd served before, and looked to be roughly the same age as my uncles, in his 40s, I suppose, with the kind of thick hair that is dark but fading to silvery grey around the edges. He had olive skin and a neatly trimmed beard, and was wearing a grey 3/4-length woolen overcoat, despite it being a warm November afternoon. His shoes were a well-polished black, and he wore matching leather gloves. His glance rested on the tray of plump black puddings sitting on the counter. "Do you make your own blood sausage?" His voice was smooth, with the merest hint of an accent. "Of course. Well, not me, but my uncles do, I responded, thinking this was a stupid question. In those days, butchers didn't sell anything they hadn't made themselves. It's their shop. And they are made using pig's blood? Yep, and some barley and oats, herbs. My voice trailed off. The guy had an odd look on his face. Why? Are your uncles in? No, they're out making deliveries. They'll be finished after 5:30 p.m, but we'll be closing around then. The man stood for a moment, tapping his fingers on the counter. He looked out the window, then checked his watch, before turning towards me. I'm short of time today, but I'd like to talk to them about their methods. He withdrew a small white rectangle from his wallet and placed it on the counter. Can you give them my card? With these words, he left. I watched him walk briskly along Kilburney Road until he disappeared from view, then retrieved the card from the counter. On it was inscribed Saul Montague in black, with the word facilitator written below in a cursive script. There was a local phone number. I propped it up on the shelf behind the counter next to the jars of pickled onions, then immediately forgot about it. It wasn't until I was sitting in class the following afternoon that I remembered the card. I felt bad that I hadn't given it to my uncles before finishing the previous day. Perhaps they'd found it already. After school, I hurried to the shop. Opening the door, I was relieved to see that the card was exactly where I'd left it. I went over and took it down from the shelf. Eddie was serving a woman with a couple of kids. When they'd left, I walked over to him. This guy came in yesterday and asked about black puddings. He was a bit odd, but he said he'd be in touch with you. He left this. Eddie read out the word facilitator, then turned the card over. The reverse side was blank. Black pudding, did you say? He queried. Is that all? Well, he asked if we made it ourselves and if it was made from pig's blood, but that's all. Sorry I forgot to tell you yesterday. I had barely finished speaking when the shop doorbell rang again, and there he was. I glanced at my watch. It was just after 4 p.m. Eddie looked at me with eyebrows raised, and I nodded. Montague went straight up to Eddie. I see you have my card. He stepped forward and extended his gloved hand. Eddie wiped his palms on his apron, then shook hands with the man. I have a proposition for you, said Montague. Is there anywhere we can talk without interruption? He didn't acknowledge having met me the previous day, directing all his attention to my uncle. I could hear chopping sounds from the workroom. We can go to the back. My brother's out there too. Are you able to mind the shop, Joe? Eddie looked my way, and it was then that the man turned and stared directly into my eyes. He had an odd expression on his face, and didn't avert his gaze when I answered, Sure. They left me alone for a decent amount of time. Then the sprung door opened, and all three came back into the shop. Montague walked through swiftly and left. Eddie and John stood by the window and watched as he walked down the road. You still okay in the shop? Asked John. Yep, I replied, and my uncles returned to the back room where I could hear them talking. Finally, my curiosity got the better of me, and I went through. What did he want? I asked. John looked at Eddie before responding. We're not exactly sure. He explained that Montague had initially inquired about the black puddings, about how often we had deliveries of pig's blood and how fresh it was, how many puddings it was likely to make, and so on. My uncles had at first thought that he wanted a regular supply of the puddings, perhaps to on-sell, but as the conversation had developed, Montague had seemed more interested in the blood itself. He asked us about supplying blood to him on a regular basis, added Eddie. We said we'd think about it. He told us it would be worth our while, whatever that means. Anyway, he's coming back on Monday after we've had time to think about it and to come up with some options. As I helped my uncles with the end-of-day tidying up tasks, I couldn't help wondering about Montague, what exactly he wanted and what on earth he'd use the blood for. It was a Friday, and I had a whole weekend to reflect on it. By Monday I was still thinking about him. It wasn't just the blood thing that had captured my attention, but the strangeness of Montague himself. After school, I hurried to the shop. Both John and Eddie were serving customers behind the counter. What I really wanted to know was whether Montague had returned and what had been decided, but I didn't know how to broach the question. In the end, I didn't need to. As with his previous 2 visits, he turned up at the shop just after 4 p.m. I was sorting the different meats in the front of shop display and made an effort not to stare at him. When I finally raised my eyes, I was disconcerted to see that once again he was looking straight back at me. He had a very direct gaze. I quickly glanced away and focused on rearranging the mock chicken legs. Eddie and John finished their sales and ushered Montague through to the workroom. On his way past, Eddie looked at me, raising his eyebrows. I nodded back. The 3 spent a good 20 minutes talking. At one point, I stood by the sprung door, straining my ears. When I had to go through to fetch Mrs. O'Grady's order, they were sitting around the desk where John worked on the accounts. They stopped talking when I came in. Avoiding eye contact, I collected the brown paper parcel and hastily retreated. It all felt very secretive. Finally, their discussion drew to a close and they came back into the shop. They shook hands, and I could see that an agreement of some kind had been reached. John turned to me. "Mr. Montague here is going to be taking collection of some products from us. He has requested that you make the delivery to his premises in person, twice a week after school." "Okay," I said. John went on. "He has a shed down by the bay. Can you go with him now so that you know where it is?" I was surprised and looked at Eddie. "You go, Joe. It's not far away. It won't take long." Montague was already half out the door. He barely acknowledged me, so I removed my apron and followed as he walked briskly down the street towards the harbour. In 10 minutes we were sitting at the waterfront area where a scattering of small boats and yachts and 2 or 3 fishing vessels were moored. The slight curve of Evans Bay was dotted with small boat sheds and a couple of larger, covered dry docks. Seagulls wheeled overhead as we approached, and some kids were fishing further down the wharf. There was the tangy smell of salt water and rust. Barnacles clung to the wharf posts just below the waterline. Montague led me to a boat shed positioned at the end of its own small jetty. Green paint was peeling from the walls in several places, and the windows were grimy and didn't offer a glimpse of what was within. The door was shut tightly and locked securely with 3 large padlocks. Montague withdrew a decent-sized keyring from his coat pocket and, using a different key for each padlock, unlocked them. They were well lubricated and opened easily. "Wait here." He went into the boat shed and returned almost immediately with a 1-gallon steel milk pail, complete with lid. He handed it to me. "This is what I want you to use. You can bring it here after 4:30 p.m. on the agreed days. I'll be here to collect it from you." He turned away. "Mr. Montague?" "What is it, boy?" "Nothing." He was locking up the door and raised his head to look at me. "That's all right, then. I'll see you next Tuesday." He returned the keys to his pocket, turned, and walked away in the opposite direction. Carrying the bucket, I made my way back to the shop. I knew I'd look stupid walking along the road with it and hoped that I didn't run into any of my classmates. Reading this, you may well think that so far my story is of no great interest, but it is difficult to convey in words the strangeness of Mr. Montague himself. I was only 15. My mind was alive with ideas of adventure and strange happenings. I had recently been reading Edgar Allan Poe and Bram Stoker, and my brain was humming with questions and suspicions. My uncles didn't really expand upon the arrangement they'd come to with Montague, and because of their reticence, I didn't raise it either. So it became something of a secret. When that first Tuesday came around, the pail was full and ready to be delivered when I arrived at the shop after school. At 4:30 p.m, I collected the pail from the workroom. The blood was so fresh that the outside of the bucket was warm to the touch, then carried it down the road to Montague's boat shed. It was heavy and awkward to carry and kept bumping into the sides of my legs. I had to change hands several times and was left with red marks on my palms after the delivery. I could see that I'd have to find a different way to carry it if possible. Montague was waiting outside as arranged. I greeted him, handed over the bucket, then stood awkwardly, waiting for his response. "Thank your uncles from me," was all he said. His look told me it was the end of the conversation, so I headed off. But after a few steps, I turned back. "The bucket. I'll need it for the next delivery. I dropped off another at your uncle's shop. When you bring the next one, I can exchange it for an empty one." "Oh." I headed back along the road. The sun was beginning to drop behind the hills and it was cool in the shade. When I looked back, the boat shed was in shadow, the door and windows tightly shut. Delivery days were Tuesdays and Fridays. It was December and getting close to Christmas. School had closed for the year and I was finished with it for good. John and Eddie had talked to Mum and it had been decided that I'd start work officially in the 3rd week of January. I still came into the shop for a few hours each day, usually in the afternoons, and had attached a wooden crate to the front of an old bike for the blood deliveries. As long as I avoided bumps, this seemed to work okay. It wasn't long before my curiosity about what Montague was up to got the better of me. I decided to do a bit of investigation of my own. On the last Friday before Christmas, after delivering the blood and returning the empty pail to the shop, I quickly retraced my route on foot. It was summer and would still be light for a couple more hours. I ordered some fish and chips from the shop across the road from the wharves, then sat to eat them on a park bench in the adjacent children's playground, partly hidden from Montague's shed by a couple of straggly trees. A bunch of seagulls appeared as soon as they saw me and vied for a position at my feet. There I sat, partly in the shade of the trees, watching, savouring the hot, salty chips. I didn't have to wait long. After about 10 minutes, the door to the boat shed opened and Montague came out. As usual, he was wearing his woolen overcoat, suit trousers and shiny black shoes. I could see him quite clearly through the vegetation. He'd closed the door and was about to lock the padlocks when he stopped, opened the door again and peered in. He seemed to be talking to someone. This I didn't expect. I wondered who or what on earth was locked inside. It didn't make sense, and I felt a prickling on my spine. I sat there for a bit, not sure what to do next. I weighed up asking my uncles about him again, but knew there'd be no point. I finished my meal and shook out the paper. The gulls fought over the last scraps, and a cool breeze started up. I gazed northwards along the bay towards Wellington Harbour. The road wound around the suburbs and back towards Oriental Bay. I was almost certain that this was the way Montague had walked, but I wasn't 100% sure. I had the feeling that he wouldn't be pleased to find me poking around near his boat shed, but after seeing him talk to someone behind those padlocked doors, I was more intrigued than ever. I decided to double back along the road a bit, then turn around and walk back to the shed, as if I was arriving for the first time. That way, if Montague did reappear, he'd think I'd only just arrived. I was sure I could invent some reason or other to explain my presence. 5 minutes later, I was on the wharf, surveying Montague's shed more closely. I realised that despite its run-down exterior, it was actually in really good shape. The items lying on the wharf around it, the heavy metal hooks, rusted chains, even an unravelling fishing net, now seemed contrived, as if added for effect. A shiny steel flue rose from the left front corner of the roof above the curling red paint of the corrugated iron. I surveyed the area. The kids fishing at the other end of the wharf were packing up their gear, and traffic was building up on Kilburney Road. At that very moment, the sun slipped behind Mount Victoria. Across Evans Bay, a golden light rose up the hills behind the Shelley Bay Air Force Base, leaving the harbour edge in a dusky shade. A gust of cool wind swept along the wharf, and the seagulls rose in unison and flew squawking into the last of the sunlight. I walked around the 3 sides of the shed. The 4th side had a ramp leading down to the water. It was high tide, and the water lapped halfway up the ramp. Unlike the remainder of the shed, the ramp was clearly in disrepair, its door nailed shut with battens. Someone had used white paint to roughly write the words, "The Larch," diagonally across it. I was about to peer through one of the windows when I felt a hand grip my shoulder. I jumped involuntarily, then half turned. "Looking for something?" My face flushed hot with embarrassment. "Have you ever heard the phrase, 'curiosity killed the cat'?" Montague's accented voice was cool. "Yes, but that's all it was. I was just curious. I didn't mean any harm." Still gripping my shoulder, Montague twisted me around to face him. With a frown on his face, he slowly looked me up and down. My shoulder hurt, and I was afraid. I was tall for my age, but Montague was taller, his figure imposing. I could sense a muscular frame beneath his coat. Of course, now I see that he was in the prime of life, but at the age of 15, anyone over 30 seemed old. I was weighing up whether I could escape from his grasp when he finally spoke. "I was going to drag you back to your uncle's, but perhaps you can be of use. Can I trust you, boy?" "Yes, I think so." His face relaxed a little. With a sigh, he let go of my shoulder, giving me a small shove as he did so. "Well, we'd better have a talk inside." He reached into his pocket and passed me his keys. "Open the locks. Use the 3 Yale keys." With shaking hands, I tried to unlock the first padlock. After a couple of unsuccessful attempts, Montague took over. He indicated that I should go in first, but I was no longer that keen to see what was inside. I cast my eyes along the wharf and across to the street beyond. There were no actual people, kids or otherwise, in sight, just cars driving past. No one would hear if I called for help. I turned the handle and pushed open the door. It was dark inside. The glass in the windows was opaque, and little of the early evening light could penetrate. It was uncomfortably warm, and I noticed the glow of a pot-belly stove in the corner to the left of the door. Montague switched on the light. The sight that met my eyes was totally unexpected. The interior had been completely refurbished. The walls and ceiling were shiny white, and the floor, also white, was tiled. The corner diagonally opposite had been partitioned off, the interior hidden by a single blue curtain hanging from a metal rod. I could hear the regular beep of a monitor of some kind, and there were several items of unfamiliar equipment in the room. One of the buckets was on the floor by the partition, empty. I looked around. It reminded me of a hospital ward. The wall facing the harbour, where there once would have been large doors leading to the ramp, was completely sealed. A wide, waist-high bench ran around 2/3 of the room, into which a stainless steel double sink was set. There was a small white refrigerator and a large wooden desk positioned against the sealed doors, and a couple of chrome and vinyl swivel chairs. The desk was stacked with a few books and some tidy piles of papers. I noticed an open spiral-bound diary covered with lines of tight writing in black ink. "What do you think?" Montague was looking for a reaction. I tried to remain calm, but he would have seen my surprise. "What is this place for?" I couldn't help but ask the obvious. It was a lot to take in. "This, dear boy, is my laboratory. It is equipped with the latest medical and scientific equipment. My work involves the study of life itself." Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of coughing from beyond the blue curtain. As it died away, the beeping of the machine seemed even louder. Montague scrutinized me. "I'm about to reveal something to you, boy. I want your word that what you are about to see will be kept between ourselves." I looked him in the eye. "My name's Joe." "I know your name. I want your word." "You have it." It had been so easy to agree, but I hadn't known what I was agreeing to. Upon this, he walked briskly to the curtain and drew it aside. I stepped closer and saw a high, single bed, made up with snowy white linen. Beneath the covers lay a young woman. A large, dull green enamelled machine of some kind, set on casters, was positioned next to her supine form. A clear plastic tube rose up to the top of a shiny metal stand, then down again all the way to the invalid. Halfway along the tube was a clear plastic cylinder, 3/4 filled with bright blood, which fed directly into a vein on her bare right forearm. I had taken all this in with my first glance, but my eyes were drawn to the sleeping figure. She was tucked in securely, with only her right arm exposed. Although asleep, she appeared restless. Her lips moved as if she were having a conversation in her dreams. A tangle of long, auburn hair spread across the pillow, framing her face. There were purple shadows under her eyes and translucent skin pulled tightly over her cheekbones. She didn't look well. "What's wrong with her?" I asked. "This is Maria. She has a rare disease, and I am in the process of implementing a cure." "If she's sick, shouldn't she be in hospital?" "A hospital cannot help her, boy." I looked back at Maria. I couldn't help thinking that there was something very wrong with the whole situation. Montague replaced the curtain and walked to the other side of the room, indicating that I should sit down beside him. It was then that he offered me a job. He explained that he was run off his feet with collecting and delivering the various items associated with his projects and could use the help. At first I refused, but he was very persuasive, explaining that it would only take a few hours a week, perhaps 10 at the most. I could fit the errands around my butcher duties once I started my apprenticeship. Additionally, he offered me a very good hourly rate. He reiterated that his work was sensitive, and I understood that this wasn't the type of work I'd discuss with anyone else, not even my uncles. And so it began. On Tuesdays, when I dropped off the blood, he would tell me when he needed me to call by during the following week. On the occasions that he had an errand for me to run, he'd invite me in, but only briefly, and I didn't get another chance to see the girl Maria for many weeks. By then, it was too late. As for the fresh pig's blood, I felt certain it had everything to do with Maria. I often found myself wondering if she was still gravely ill, or if her health was improving. After I'd been running Montague's errands for more than a month, he provided me with a set of the padlock keys, emphasizing that they were only to be used in a case of extreme emergency. I realized that he trusted me. Around the 3rd week in March, everything changed. It was a Tuesday evening, and I turned up at the boat shed with the bucket of blood. When I arrived, I was surprised to see that the padlocks were still in place. I knocked on the door, then looked around to see if Montague had left a note, but there was nothing. I took out my keys, aware that my heart had begun to beat faster. I pushed open the door. It was dark inside and cooler than usual, the only glow coming from a lamp beyond the curtain. I turned on the lights, placed the bucket of blood on the bench, and walked over to the desk, looking over my shoulder, expecting Montague to show up at any moment. There wasn't a note there, either. By now my heart was racing, and my one thought was that this was my chance to check on Maria. With trepidation I walked over to the curtain and drew it back a little from the corner. There she was, propped up a little in the bed, studying a picture book held in her left hand. She looked up, clearly startled to see me. I was struck by the colour of her eyes. They were a very dark brown, almost black, but with a ruby hue. Her skin had a pinkish tinge, as if she were feverish. "Hi," I said. "I've brought the blood for Mr. Montague. He's not here, so I've left it on the bench." She didn't say anything. "You must be Maria. I'm Joe." Maria's eyes were fixed on me, watching every movement. She seemed to be glued to the bed, with her right arm still attached to the transfusion tube. I was absolutely sure now that this was what it was. There was no way to tell how much blood was left in the machine, but it appeared that it was fed in from the top through a stainless steel funnel-type arrangement. I noticed a small glass bottle of transparent liquid also feeding into the machine, inscribed with the handwritten words, "Antigen suppressant." Maria opened her mouth as if to speak, but the effort must have been too much for her as she fell back upon her pillow, breathing in short gasps, her body trembling. I realized there was no point in asking her any more questions, as my presence seemed to be making her agitated. She had started to quiver uncontrollably. I wasn't sure what to do, so I scribbled a note on the back of an envelope and left it on Montague's desk. Other than that, I could only wait for him to get in touch with me. If nothing else, he'd need to give me the list of days he wanted me to come in for the next week. As I made my departure, turning off the lights on the way, I touched the potbelly. It was quite cold. When Thursday arrived and Montague still hadn't contacted me, I was starting to wonder. I decided to visit the boat shed during my lunch hour on the off chance that he might be there. When I drew nearer, my heart sank as I saw the padlocks were still in place. I let myself in. There was no sign that Montague had been back, and the air was stale and smelt of decay. I could hear the machine beeping urgently from the corner. Almost too afraid to look, I made my way over and drew aside the curtain. Maria was lying in the bed, barely conscious. The transfusion tube had dried up and the entry point in her arm was inflamed. The bottle of clear fluid feeding into the machine was empty. I stood there, paralyzed with uncertainty. Finally, I wet a rag under the tap and wiped her brow, but she barely moved. The bucket of blood was still sitting on the bench where I'd left it. I lifted the lid and wasn't surprised to see that it had started to go bad. I emptied it into the sink and rinsed it out. I went over to Montague's desk, hoping to find some clue as to what he was up to with Maria. My note was still there, of course. Sifting through his papers, I noted that his correspondence was mostly associated with orders for medical supplies and an exchange of ethical ideas with, what I assumed was, a colleague in Germany. The spiral notepad was nowhere to be seen. It was then that I noticed an old book Montague had left on his desk. It was lying open and had thick, yellowing pages with lines of ornate Gothic script. The page to the left had the heading, Blood, Pig, and Sjolf. On the right was a simple illustration depicting 3 figures, 2 men and a pig. One of the men was standing over the other, who was lying on a bed. The unfortunate pig was strapped to a bench alongside. It appeared that the pig's throat had been slit. The blood was squirting out and being collected in a container. I had no idea what it meant and quickly shut the book. When I returned to Maria's bedside, her eyes were open, but she didn't seem aware of her surroundings. I decided to straighten up the bedding and, as I did, the sheets came away from the side of the bed. I pulled them back to smooth them out and was concerned to see that she was restrained by 3 leather belts at the chest, waist, and hips. Looking further, I noticed 2 rubber tubes leading from beneath the hem of her simple white gown to a couple of bags similar in size and appearance to hot water bottles tucked into a bracket at the end of the bed. They looked full. By this time I was shaking all over. Then my eyes focused on the unfathomable. Maria's gown had risen up a little. Instead of feet peeping out below the hem, I saw 2 pig's trotters. I thought my heart would leap from my breast. I quickly pulled the bedding back and tucked it in securely. It was time to leave. I had no idea what to do. That evening I went to the library to check the newspapers from the previous few days. I found what I was seeking on page 3 of the Wednesday edition of the Evening Post. It was a brief item about a man's body having been found washed up at Shelley Bay. It stated that the deceased was bearded, aged around 40 to 50, and had been clad in a heavy woolen coat. There was no indication of wrongdoing, and it was suspected that he'd fallen out of a boat or off a wharf and had been weighed down by the coat and had subsequently drowned. Police had requested that people come forward if they had any information. The next day I told my uncles about Montague's non-appearance and the item in the newspaper, leaving out any mention of what I'd found in the boat shed. I needed time to think everything through. They suggested that if he still didn't show up on Friday, we should contact the police. On Friday, when I biked down to the shed with the fresh pig's blood, I was almost certain it would be for the last time. I unlocked the door and was hit with an overpowering smell of stale bodily fluids. Horrible grunting noises were coming from the corner, and I had to force myself to investigate. When I pulled back the curtain, I saw that my worst fears had been realized. The creature that had once been Maria had diminished in size. The head and face were distorted. A few coarse, white whiskers had sprung up around its jowls, and the teeth were exposed behind a scary grin. The tube had come away from its front leg, for a leg it clearly was, and the picture book was lying, partly chewed, on the floor. The creature had been thrashing around on the bed, and what was left of the beautiful auburn hair was a matted mess, most of it lying in tangled clumps on the pillow. The rubber tubes had disconnected, and the bedding was badly soiled. The creature was emitting plaintive grunting noises and clearly wanted to escape. Its dark eyes looked at me wildly. This time I knew what I had to do. It's not that I wanted to do it, but the creature was obviously in severe distress. God only knew what Montague had done to it during the course of his experiments. With a heavy heart, I left Montague's boat shed and made my way back to the shop. Once there, I collected my new set of butchering knives, honing my best boning knife until it was razor sharp before packing them up in my leather satchel. Then I walked back to the harbour, all the while thinking about the image in the old book I'd seen on Montague's desk. It was a simple matter to dispatch Maria. She was already restrained, after all. Before attempting the task, I removed all the bedding from under her body and positioned the stainless steel bucket beneath the bed to collect the blood. As I gripped her head to hold it still and raised my knife, I swear that her eyes looked as human as they had been before her body had reverted to its original self. Before I left, I retrieved the old book from Montague's desk and screwed up the note I'd left for him. I put both into my satchel with the knives. Later that day, I asked my uncles to sit themselves down. explaining that I had something serious to discuss with them. I updated them on how Montague had asked me to run errands for him and how he'd been conducting experiments on a pig in that boat shed. They weren't as surprised as they might have been. I suspected that Montague had been paying them extremely well, and that despite their reservations, they'd appreciated the money. I also told them about how the poor pig had been strapped to a bed and neglected since Montague's disappearance. I then explained that I'd taken it upon myself to kill the poor animal, and that I needed to dispose of the remains. The three of us took the butcher's van down to the boat shed. I let my uncles in, and they carried the carcass out to the back of the vehicle. John commented that it was a poor specimen of a pig, and would only be good for making sausages. I stuffed the bedding into a large plastic bag, and we took the mattress too, as there was a fair bit of blood on it. I locked up the shed for the last time. And that should have been the end of the story. After about a month passed, I rang the police to report Montague as missing. A couple of constables came by to interview me, with my uncles sitting in. We showed them Montague's card, and I explained that I had delivered blood to Montague twice weekly, and that I sometimes ran other errands for him. I left out the bit about having access to his shed or about seeing the pig. I told them that we hadn't seen sight or sound of Montague since sometime in February, that we'd had to throw out 3 buckets of perfectly good fresh blood that we hadn't been paid for. After the interview, I accompanied the police to Evans Bay to show them the boat shed. They called for help and were able to break the locks on the door. Inside, the room was exactly as I'd left it. I could see that the constables were more than a little surprised at the interior. I stood by as they gaped, until one looked up, saw me, and told me I could go. The police contacted me again a few days later. They felt certain that our description of Montague matched that of an unidentified person who'd been found drowned in the harbour in March. I feigned surprise. They thanked me for coming forward, as they were glad to have that mystery solved. They were now hoping for information about his next of kin. 2 months later, I had my final call from the police. They'd located Montague's next of kin, a sister in England. She had only just reported him missing after not having received any correspondence for a couple of months. They asked me if I'd ever seen anyone else with Montague. No, never. Why? It seems that Mr. Montague was taking care of his niece, Maria. She had a serious ailment. He was apparently working on a cure, and she had been placed in his care. Her mother is desperate to hear from her. "Oh," I said, my voice weak. "That's terrible." "Yes, it is. You definitely didn't come across Maria?" "No, I wouldn't have," I stammered. "I mean, I only made deliveries and ran the odd errand." "Oh, that's a shame. We have no other leads. Well, it seems we're finished here. Ring us straight away if you do think of anything." "Yes, of course." As I hung up the phone, I felt bile rise in my throat. That batch of pork sausages had been a great favourite with the customers. Last episode, I mentioned that I had reached out to several authors from my home country of New Zealand. Well, I had expected to start, with their generous permission, featuring their works on Tom's Terra Trove in the new year, 2026. Now, to appropriate something Lennon didn't actually say, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happened. Hyperbolic perhaps, but suffice to say that you, dear listeners, are going to get a whole basket, a whole kete full of new, and I mean new. These authors, unlike the writers of my usual fare, are all alive. Stories, starting sooner than anticipated. Hiatus, schmiatus. Since I'm recording this afterward on rather crummy equipment, I won't say too much more, except to give a wee blurb on Jane as a writer, and direct you to where you can find more about her and her work. Jane writes literary realist fiction with immersive detail, often weaving in subtle or overtly speculative elements to reveal the unexpected in ordinary experiences. And you can check out her blog at www.heniirihapiti.com. That is www.heni-irihapeti.com. I hope to stage a more fulsome discussion of Jane's writing when I'm back in the studio, and perhaps, if I'm lucky, recording another of her stories. Now, there's a particularly excellent one in the collection Cthulhu, Land of the Long White Cloud. If you've enjoyed this episode, do subscribe and stick around. We've still got some very exciting tales to come, and then I'll be back with a vengeance in early 2026. By the way, I do all this myself, the wonderful voice actors who contribute their talents to the crawling world notwithstanding, and therefore, liking, subscribing, commenting, and rating wherever you happen to be listening helps out the podcast/channel immensely. My thanks to those who do show their support, however that may manifest, whether it's a donation, a comment, a review, etc. Thank you to you all. With that, I will bid you good night and farewell for now. Take care. It's a scary world out there.